Welcome, my friends, to the world of Hero Quest, a place unlike any other. Remember a time when tabletop gaming meant more than just pushing plastic around a pre-printed board? A time before 3D printers, when creativity was king and every game felt like a personal odyssey. We're talking about the 90s, baby. A golden age where gateway games like Hero Quest, Battle Masters, and the mighty Space Crusade ignited our imaginations. But for many people, all roads led to one ultimate destination: Warhammer 40,000, 2nd edition. Was this Games Workshop's master plan? Today we're diving into the heart of that connection, specifically how Space Crusade, with its iconic miniatures and accessible gameplay, was a direct pipeline to its sprawling, grimdark universe of Warhammer 40k. And we're going to celebrate the true unsung hero of 90s gaming, Floorhammer. This is the Fair Weatherman. Welcome back to the channel. This project was a welcome break from my Hero Quest painting slog. Currently I'm about halfway through the wonderful journey of painting the original miniatures from the Hero Quest gaming system. Here's a sneak peek of my Undead army. I love how ghoulish everything is turning out. Thank you, Rush the Wash, for the helpful tutorial. Here you can see how awesome these little guys look on top of my Warhammer tabletop build. Stay tuned for a future video where I'll showcase my entire army of chaos. So, you've battled your way through the dreadnoughts and wiped out countless Genestealers in Space Crusade. Now you've got a squad of Blood Angels, an awesome commander, and maybe even some Eldar. Now what? Well, the beauty of Games Workshop in the 90s was the incredible synergy between their games. Those Space Crusade miniatures weren't just for one game. They were your ticket to the big leagues. Warhammer 40,000, 2nd edition. Let's get into this. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Your Space Crusade Space Marines, Orks, Genestealers, and even those awesome Chaos androids were all part of the Warhammer world. These miniatures were perfectly usable in Warhammer 40k 2nd edition. The scale was right on the 28mm bases, the aesthetic was spot on, and suddenly your small squad of heroes could become part of a much larger army, battling across a devastated future. You'd find their stats, their weapon profiles, and even special rules for many of these units right there in the Warhammer 40k rulebooks and supplements of the time. It was a brilliant way to expand your collection without breaking the bank, transforming a board game purchase into an investment in a much deeper and expensive hobby. I bought a pack of Necromunda bases and based up all of my Space Marines for Space Crusade because I feel like the base really does look great on the board. But another thing that I did a couple months back was magnetize all of the weapons. Very simple process to do. You can find tutorials all over the internet on it. You just Dremel out a little hole to fit the size magnets that you pick, and that way you can easily interchange the weapons, which now that we are going to start playing Warhammer 2nd edition, depending on the points values, we're more than likely going to start with a 400 or 500 point game, but you can now then interchange your Marines with the specific weapons that you're going to use. So I'm really happy with these results. I'm also grateful that I picked up a Space Marine Terminator for Space Crusade, as well as a Librarian and some Scouts. I realized in White Dwarf they had added the addition of these minis, and now I have them to use on the board to lead some of my more general Space Marines with bolters. I am going to pick up a Space Marine Flamer, as well as the traditional 90s Space Marine Mini that's resemblant of the Mini on the game box. I also purchased some secondhand Orks. I wanted to utilize these cards for the Ork faction that you can use in Space Crusade, and now it turns out it's going to work perfect with 2nd edition. Eventually, when I get around to painting Space Crusade, I'm going to paint these guys up to look like freebooters, and so I now have a handful of these Orks ready to go on my tabletop. I'm not sure what edition these are from, nor do I really care. I'm just all about having fun with my son. So these did come on like larger 32mm bases, I believe, and I rebased them on 28. And that way they'll fit in Space Crusade on the board as well as work perfectly now for this edition. I also have a couple 3D printed squigs and a Gretchen pirate, since I'm gonna go with the freebooter theme. Missing a leg here. I think it's gonna look great painted up as well. I also have a set of Eldari miniatures that I'm gonna use for my Eldar Attacks expansion for Space Crusade. These are primed and ready for paint. I just hadn't got around to painting them just yet. But we can use them now in Warhammer 2nd Edition as well. I would have loved to have acquired a set of 90s Eldari minis, but these just happen to be easier to acquire on eBay. And last but not least, I have a handful of these Tyranids from the mid to late 90s. I also picked up on eBay and painted them up a couple months back in the retro 90s style of the original metal minis. I really love these. I think I spent a couple hours one night and just batch painted them all. I was so excited to get them and to give them this retro paint job, I just couldn't stop. They look really great on the board, and I do know that Tyranid faction was also included in 2nd edition, and so they're going to look lovely on the board going to battle against our Space Marines. I do feel like I have a lot of material to work with in learning how to play this game. And at the current price point of getting into Warhammer right now, 10th edition or 11th edition, whatever one that they're on, I feel like this is the most beneficial for me. And quite honestly, it's 90s retro. Like, I am all about this. I'm sure there's many people out there who are playing this one still or discovering it for the first time. It's nice to know that we're not alone. This brings us to another cornerstone of 90s tabletop gaming, Floorhammer. Before the birth of cheap 3D printers, before laser-cut MDF terrain kits were readily available, if you wanted cool battlefields, you simply made them. Your living room floor became your canvas, and household items found in the recycle bin were your building blocks. Back then, the smell of PVA glue and cheap acrylic paint was the official scent of the hobby. You weren't worried about the texture paints or airbrushes. You were worried about finding the right Rice Krispie cereal box that was big enough for the fortress and hoping you didn't run out of glue before the sun went down. Cardboard boxes transformed into imposing imperial bunkers. Tinfoil and crumpled newspapers became alien landscapes. Heck, Games Workshop included the templates for a battle bunker in the White Dwarf magazine. Old CDs, bottle caps, and even leftover plastic packaging all were fair game. You didn't just play on terrain, you built your worlds. It was messy, but it was yours. And after a couple of hours, your fingers were stained with superglue and paint to remind you of how much fun you had. Each piece had a story, each battlefield was unique, and the immersion was incredible. This wasn't just gaming, it was crafting, problem solving, and a true test of imagination. And it fostered a sense of ownership and creativity that sometimes is lost in today's ready-made world of 3D printing and professional model kits. That Space Crusade Dreadnought, now a proud centerpiece of your 2nd edition army, would lumber past a bunker made of a cornflakes box, strategically placed behind a rock formation, crafted from an old shoebox and some PVA glue. The connection was seamless, and the creative joy was boundless. What happened to this kind of tabletop gaming? So let's take a look at how I made this terrain, and I'll show you how simple it was with just a handful of supplies from your local hobby shop and a lot of can-do attitude. Think 90s for this one. The first thing I did was go online and try to find the scans of the original terrain that came in the Warhammer 2nd edition box. It was hard to find all the pieces, but I ended up using just a handful of them. I printed these out on cardstock, glued them to cardboard, and then I actually got some grout from Hobby Lobby, and I used some grout, tile grout, to kind of give this transitional texture. It is recommended in the How to Build Wargaming Terrain book for you to take a hobby knife and not to have such a blunt edge, but kind of come in at a 45 and just make a smoother transition. And then once that was done and dried, I went about cutting some more card. I used cracker boxes or cereal boxes and added some tiles down there. primed everything in black, and then started painting. I did find out of my bits box a couple pieces of shields. This is like a little skull that went on Night Goblin shields. Then I dropped some wood from some of our aquariums that we had in the attic. Topped it off with some PVA glue for some flocking, and everything I think turned out really nice. I did this a couple times over. Here's another one, slightly different structure. I had a styrofoam ball there I kind of cut to look like a stone. Some more little hedges. And then this right here actually was cut from this larger aquarium bush that we had in the attic. So just cutting a few of these off and adding them throughout the board just to add some kind of cohesiveness to all the other pieces. So this stuff is cheap. You can get this at Walmart for a couple bucks. I used one and used it throughout all of these pieces. Here we have the classic 90s cactuses. So we just used a couple styrofoam balls with cocktail sticks. One tip I can give you when you go about painting is make sure that you cover these balls completely with PVA glue before you use the spray paint on them. I thought I had covered it enough, but turns out I didn't. And so the actual chemicals in the spray paint will eat the styrofoam, and so that's where I went about dropping some flocking over those areas, which I think in the end made it look really cool. But if you want that traditional look of just a solid styrofoam ball, you want to make sure you cover it enough in PVA glue before you go about spray painting it. I made a total of 3 of these, all slightly different sizes, just to add some differentiation around the board for our troops to hide behind. Here we have probably one of my favorite pieces. We had gone to one of the local Warhammer stores and saw that there was a crater on one of the game boards. So I just grabbed some styrofoam that I used for some of the larger pieces and cut it up to have kind of a hole in the center. Used more of that grout around it, and then glued a bunch of different size stones. And then when it all dried, I primed the whole thing. This is also put on just the bottom of cardboard. And then I really had a lot of fun once the primer was done, going about using my dry brushing, dropping more different types of stone to add the different coloring, and then topping it all off with some flock. I feel like what really made all of these pieces pop was buying a $12 box of different types of grasses that you can stick on there. And so that added a little bit more dimension and color. The crater's large enough for one of the Space Marines to sit in there and hide out on Overwatch. Here's one of the larger pieces. This was made with typical styrofoam, just cutting it to shape. And how I went about flocking this was covering the whole thing first in plaster of Paris. But these are not very heavy. The plaster of Paris wasn't all that difficult to work with. And then I painted everything green because I know eventually this flock's gonna start to chip off. And once it was painted, I PVA glued the whole thing and started sprinkling areas for sand and then putting in more of these wood pieces. I did see that some people online put the wood in first and then primed the whole thing. But I wanted to keep the natural wood aesthetic in there, so I put that in last. And then, like I said, all of these little terrain hedges really made this piece come to life. I did leave the top large enough for us to add 3D printed terrain on top, or to even drop in one of the ruined pieces, allowing you to change up the game board from game to game. But as you can see, we had a good time creating a couple different sized terrain pieces. This one we embedded some of the ruins into the side of the mountain for cover. And then just adding rocks and stone and sand really did make these pieces come to life. This is the largest piece that we created out of the bunch, with a large enough surface on top to hold one of these ruined pieces. I did use more of the fish tank plant here, so troops can take some soft cover in here, making a real fun mountaintop that is a little bit easier to traverse on one side and harder on the other. And then for one of the more simpler pieces out of all of this, I got the idea for this from one of the terrain build videos we watched before we started out on this project. Just cutting an old doormat. So this is one of the pieces that we cut. I think initially the idea from the build was to just cut a piece and use it as a wheat field. But I decided to take it one step further and cut out tracks from some type of vehicle that maybe had driven through, as well as add a bit more of these shields from the bits box, as if maybe a farmer found them and placed them out here for someone to come back and collect. This version right here, I took some old pieces of sprue that the shields came off of and just kind of glued it together and made it look like some farming equipment that was left in the field, maybe a tractor base or something. I really do feel like these added details really make the game come to life, and I hope it will allow us to have a more thematic gameplay experience. This is probably my most exciting piece of terrain that we built. We just utilized the same techniques, but this time we added a bit of foam board and cut a base for the bottom of our kind of farm structure here. The dice that I ordered for Warhammer 2nd edition came in this little dice box. And so what better way to utilize the box than to turn it into some type of structure on the board. And so that's what we did. This is actually the lid of the box that went over here. We glued it upside down, added some more of these tile pieces around the whole structure, more bits to add farming equipment here, just kind of thrown off to the side. And then I went through my bits box and found some of these bases that I bought, and I had a bunch of them left over. So I thought maybe we can add some type of a landing pad or something here. I cut up a couple different ones here and made it look like it was disheveled and maybe broken from a bombing strike or something previous. And then topped it all off with some, weeds that grew and some different types of sand, some more flocking. And then most importantly, you have to do this. Add a can from your recycle bin and just a plastic straw. And I really wanted to keep these raw elements just on the board as a memory that these things were just built out of recycled materials. The top, I also cut more of that rug, made it look like this was maybe a silo full of grain. And this would just sit there. I made it to where it can come apart so it can fit in the box a little bit easier. But I do feel like this added a really fun piece that our Marines will be able to hide behind as they go to war. And that leads us to probably the most difficult build out of all of this terrain, the bunker. And you'll be able to find this PDF document on the Warhammer 2nd edition Facebook page. I used an old shredded mini wheats box for it, but this one I printed off and spent a morning gluing and cutting. As you can see, it's not perfect. I ended up using hot glue because the PVA was just taking too long to dry to hold these things in place. But I do feel like you have to have something like this on the table. I've seen 3D printed versions of this that look really nice, but man, if we're gonna play a 90s Warhammer, we gotta do it old school. This is an awesome piece to have on the board. I also found some more PDF scans of terrain that was most likely added in White Dwarf. This one was probably the most simplest one to build. It's cool. I wanted to add a lot of these paper materials as well, just to bring it back to that retro Warhammer style. You don't need a lot of money to have a great time playing this game. You can also see that I've littered the game board with a lot of these 3D printed cargo bins. I found a guy on Etsy that had printed these for me. These are really fun elements to add throughout all the other structures that we created. So you've got your miniatures, your Space Crusade Blood Angels, Orks, and Genestealers. And we've embraced the art of Floorhammer. But how do you actually play a game of Warhammer 40k 2nd edition without tracking down expensive decade-old books? The answer lies in the incredible community that keeps this classic edition alive. The core rulebooks, unit codices, and even the cardboard gaming tiles and plastic overlays that made the game so distinctive are often available online in high-quality PDF form. To grab most of all of this content that you'll need to play Warhammer 40k 2nd edition, you'll want to head over to Project Anvil. The community there has kept this game alive for decades. You can find those digital files, print them out yourself, and bind the rulebooks for just a few dollars. Think about it, a full rule set for less than the cost of a modern single supplement. If you want to dive right into a 400 or 500 point skirmish, you can print the necessary unit profiles for your Space Crusade figures and be ready to roll dice instantly. You'll also want to check out the Facebook page, where I found the mission cards that were a little bit harder to track down. I spent about $80 at my local Hobby Lobby and $20 at Barons of Dice for the proprietary dice used in this edition. And those specialized dice are crucial for 2nd edition's unique mechanics. Add the minimal printing cost, and for around $100, I have most everything to get started playing Warhammer from the red years of Games Workshop. My hobby haul covered the materials for all of this terrain: cardboard, paints, glue, and more than enough flock to last a lifetime of building. You have effectively jump-started a complete, historically accurate tabletop game experience. The brilliant part is how easily accessible it is. You are reusing your classic Space Crusade figures and your newfound DIY terrain building skills, marrying them with readily available community-supported rule sets. It's the ultimate low-investment, high-creativity hobby project, completely recapturing the spirit of the 90s, where resourcefulness was a virtue. And if you're reluctant to start getting your hands full of PVA and flock, I've attached an easy video tutorial from Broadsword Wargaming, as well as a link to the original How to Make Your Wargames Terrain book by Nigel Stillman from 1996. Easily accessible on Imager to come up with ideas on how to go about building your terrain. I'm really proud of this Warhammer 40k 2nd edition build and feel like I've mastered the art of Mod Podge and cutting cards. Ultimately, even if I did purchase the box for $450, I would still wind up at Hobby Lobby to create my authentic 90s board. So I feel like the miniatures found in Space Crusade has really made for a fun experience for me and my son. Something that I hope he'll remember us building many years from now. So there you have it. From the structured adventures of Space Crusade, with its accessible rules and iconic miniatures, to the sprawling strategic battles of Warhammer 40k 2nd edition, the path was clear. And along the way, the spirit of Floorhammer kept my imagination burning bright, making this era of gaming one of the most creative and rewarding of all time. 90s tabletop wasn't just about rolling dice. It was about building worlds, fostering creativity, and forging memories that last a lifetime. I'm blessed with the opportunity to discover this world with my son. So next time you look at a classic Space Crusade miniature, remember its potential. Remember the humble beginnings on the living room floor, where many of you started. And remember that sometimes the most epic battles are fought on the most imaginative terrain. 2025 has been a really fun year for me to collect these old vintage board games. It started out the first of the year when I picked up Advanced Hero Quest. And since then, I've repainted and restored the game. I can't wait to work my way through Hero Quest, the original 1989 version, and then soon on into Space Crusade. I've been fortunate enough this year to purchase some of these old 90s classics that I never had my hands on when I was younger. Games like Advanced Hero Quest, Warhammer Quest, and even picking up some of my old favorites like Battle Masters. The past year, I've seen my channel grow beyond just Hero Quest with the addition of other 90s tabletop RPGs, and I'm truly grateful for all of y'all out there. I'm almost at that 2,000 subscriber mark, so it'd be a joy if I can reach that before the end of 2025. I can't imagine where we're going to end up in 2026, but I'm hopeful that I'll be able to restore and get back to my love of painting and bringing you more tabletop gaming, as well as looking forward to what Hero Quest is going to look like in 2026. Once again, thanks for watching, and if you made it this far, be sure you comment, like, and subscribe for more vintage tabletop RPG content. And if you'd like to support my work, you can pitch in by buying me a coffee and refilling my cup for the next one. As always, danger you will soon discover lurks in every shadow. Come, let the quest begin.